Well, as we said at the beginning of the show, it looks like the British government is going to step in to protect Scottish children and young people from the Gender Recognition Bill, which was passed by the Scottish Parliament. It allows you to begin gender transformation, gender reassignment, age 16, without parental consent and indeed without a diagnosis of gender dysmorphia. And in fact, there's only now a 3-month reflection period. Trans activists are delighted, and I don't think they're necessarily bad people, but I do think that we have badly lost our way as a society. Anyway, Maren Smith from For Women Scotland is with me. Maren, how are you?
Hi. Still shocked. Still shocked and disappointment, especially about my government refusing to safeguard women and girls against convicted rapists and paedophiles. That was truly, truly horrifying to see.
So, okay, look, there's various things we can talk about. We can talk about protection of children. We can talk about the way that Scotland's been hijacked, and we can talk about what I call the war on women, the idea that now they're in, say, the University of Pennsylvania, whichever, you're never going to come first, second, or third in the swimming because there's 3 ladies with big chests and penises that win, and you will only come 4th, 5th, or 6th. So, but why don't we start with what's happened in Scotland so far? Because whilst I appreciate we broadcast in Scotland, there's going to be people in England, there's going to be people in Wales, there's going to be people in Northern Ireland who the first they heard of this was when it passed yesterday.
Yeah. Well, it passed today. It was supposed to pass yesterday. That's part of the issues we're having with this, is that the government decided to push this through without proper scrutiny.
Right.
And that included, for instance, we lost a judicial review last week, which was very important, and it established that a gender recognition certificate, which is the measure that we're discussing with this reform, gender recognition does in fact change a person's sex legally for all purposes, and this has an impact on spaces and services for women.
Yes.
And the government was asked by Conservative MSPs to please set aside some time to discuss what this judgment will actually mean for this bill that was just about to get voted through, and the government refused.
Yes.
Now, there's a real problem here. There is a problem in that everybody in the legal profession, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, and a lot of women's rights groups, ourselves included, are saying we actually still don't know how the Equality Act and this newly reformed law will work together.
So am I allowed now? Am I allowed to go to Scotland, declare I am a woman, and 3 months later go into women's changing rooms?
Not quite.
Okay.
The bill must still be put forward for royal assent. And there is usually a time between the bill getting voted through and this happening. So it's about 4 weeks, it might be longer. And if the UK government is persuaded that this reform bill will actually have an impact on the Equality Act, and remember, the Equality Act is universal to all of the UK, and yes, the Scottish government does not have the right to make any changes to this. Now, the Scottish government has argued we're not making any changes, but the UK government is quite rightly concerned that when the new bill is when it's implemented, that this will in effect change provisions in the Equality Act. And the UK government has an option to go nuclear, as someone put it today, and use the Scotland Act section, I think it's section 35, to stop this bill. We don't know
which is what? It gives the government a veto?
It's a government veto, yes, because it can say that the Scottish government is interfering in a
UK-wide law. Yeah, sure.
In a UK-wide law, and it doesn't have the right to do that. The Scottish government has not got the right to make any changes to the Equality Act.
This may be a silly question, and if it is, you can call me a fool for asking it. Why is this such a big issue in Scotland? Sorry. Why is gender recognition such a big issue? I fully understand why your opposition to the bill is a big issue.
Well, I'm sure that I'm actually quite sure that the Scottish government's quite bewildered at the strong opposition to this. I think they thought this was going to go through, and eventually we would all give up and go home. I'm not sure why exactly, but I think there is a real problem in Scotland in that all of the services we depend on, like rape crisis, women's aid, these kind of services, they're all government funded in Scotland. And the Scottish government has made having a trans inclusive policy a requirement for funding. And they did that in 2012. So we've got a lot of issues already because they've introduced blanket policies without ever considering the impact on women. And maybe because Scotland's quite small in that sense, quite contained, that we don't have a lot of alternatives.
Yes.
So if we can't go to these government-funded services, then we're very often stuck. And there's not really anywhere you can go. And because Scotland is actually, geographically speaking, it's really quite big, you might have to travel quite a while before you can get to a service. So it really does matter a lot. Part of the problem might be that we've had the same government in place for a long time now, and they have been able to push these things through without an effective opposition. The Conservatives have tried, but they don't have the numbers. Bless you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't think you could hear that. I pressed the cough button, and I'm so sorry. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I see you. That's why.
Fine. Okay. Great. Okay. Well, look, I gave the example of Ian Huntley, who murdered Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman,
yes,
as somebody who wanted to be trans in order to move into a women's prison. Look, you've also given examples of rapists and paedophiles and whatever. And I want to stress more than anything else, I don't think, and I assume you don't think, that every person who's trans is in that position. The concern is about how bad people can exploit legislation like this, isn't it?
Well, the concern is quite simple in that it is male offenders who we are concerned about.
Yes.
We're not concerned about all men, because all men don't commit these crimes.
Sure.
The problem we have is that those males who do offend and who do commit crimes, violent crimes, sexual crimes against women and children, we can't tell them apart by looking at them. It's not possible. So we actually have in place a lot of safeguards, and decent men accept these safeguards because they know they protect their own wives, their own daughters, sisters, mums. And there are only a few people who would cross these boundaries. And in the past, you could have challenged these people because your mere presence in a woman's space means you're crossing the boundary you shouldn't be crossing. In the future, our problem is that this person, this male person, might have a gender recognition certificate that says he's legally female. And he may have a right to be in that space. And I might be the bad person.
Yeah, so do you, if I turn around, if my niece gets changed in a changing room and she says I don't even know what we're meant to use as a language, but if there's a bloke in there, right?
Yes. Well, I say men and women in line with biology. So
okay. I'll buy that. I'll buy that. Somebody who's biologically male is in there, and I sort of make a complaint, and they go, oh, the way the lefties talk. Andre Walker discriminated against a trans person who was doing nothing wrong other than going to local swimming baths. I'd be in trouble, wouldn't I?
You might well be, because the problem is a lot of the times we focus on safety, we focus on preventing crimes, but actually a lot of women feel very uncomfortable. Women and girls don't want to get changed in front of a stranger. They don't know. And there's nothing wrong with wanting privacy and dignity.
Of course.
And having autonomy over your own body and being able to just say, well, actually, I don't want to get changed in the presence of males. I don't want to be cared for by a male carer when I've asked for a female carer. I want to be in a hospital ward when I feel vulnerable and I need help. And I want to be, in a ward with other women. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that.
But I heard this ludicrous situation in a university where basically somebody got thrown out of the lesbian, gay, bisexual and transsexual society because they were a lesbian woman who wouldn't date somebody who's biologically male who self-defined as a woman. And you
Yes,
think, well,
and this is one of the reasons why lesbians have been at the forefront of the opposition to enshrining self-identification in law, because this really started to affect lesbians really badly, much earlier than the wider population. In especially, I mean, in Scotland, Magdalene Barnes had issues in 2016. She's one of the co-founders of For Women Scotland. Sadly, she passed away, but she got into trouble for stating out loud that lesbians don't have penises. I mean, that's just. That is just a simple matter-of-fact statement.
But what stops me from self-defining as a dog?
Nothing.
I mean, according to the same logic, because I mean, I understand when people go, well, if it makes you happy. Hey, look, Maren, if it makes you happy to dress up as a dog, dress up as a dog. I mean, I would, not that it's any of my business, but I would encourage you to do what makes you happy as long as it doesn't harm other people. But when you are talking about women's prisons where many women in women's prisons, and I don't want to stereotype or let people off the hook who've committed violent crimes, but many women in women's prisons are victims of abuse themselves, whether that be historically or more recently. And the idea of having some burly fella called Susan wandering around, I find utterly ludicrous.
Well, it's not just ludicrous; it's actually really harmful to the women in there. So we have in Scotland Rona Hotchkiss. She is a former prison governor, and since her retirement, she's been talking about what it does to the women in prison when violent males are transferred into the female estate, and they can, in the female estate, then mingle freely with female prisoners, and they don't even have to do anything. Very often, a vulnerable, traumatized woman will be frightened of even sympathetic men. They don't have to behave badly. If you're traumatized enough, just the mere presence of a man can set you back. And Rona Hotchkiss has talked about that quite a lot. The way she puts it is, it's never not a problem when you incarcerate males with female prisoners.
Absolutely. Now, look, I want to talk about For Women Scotland just for a couple of moments.
Yes.
And it's not necessarily because I'm particularly interested in your organisation. It's just to understand the nature of the opposition to the Scottish Government, the SNP, on this. So look, I mean, I imagine that there's kind of roughly two groups. Kind of parental groups, well, maybe three groups: parental groups, those on the Christian right or the religious right, and those perhaps, lesbian groups and whatever, who would be more traditionally on the political left. How does the opposition form together, and kind of what's the background of For Women Scotland?
The background of For Women Scotland is just noticing that self-identification policies were starting to cause problems in schools, hospitals, and in women's services. And noticing that the law, which, I mean, we started the consultations obviously with the UK government, and then the Scottish government, and then taken part in these, in the consultations, in the public process of lawmaking, and being thwarted, being told that we're not stakeholders, we shouldn't be taking part in this, we should stay out of it, we should shut up about it. It had nothing to do with women's rights. And of course, we knew already from our own experiences as women in places that used to be women only, but now increasingly were using trans-inclusive policies, that if this was enshrined in law, it may cause further problems. Now, the religious right isn't really that well organised in Scotland, so we don't really encounter when we meet up, we don't really encounter them. But they certainly exist, because if you look at all the submissions that the Parliament receives on these issues, there certainly are Christian groups in there. There's a lot of children's rights campaigners who are very concerned, and I believe you talked about that earlier.
Yes.
The impact on children. And there are a lot of women's rights groups, lesbian groups, and of course, For Women Scotland focuses on both women's rights and children's rights. So we're active in both areas. We're trying to raise awareness about the medical transition and the harms of medical transition, which is what obviously you discussed earlier. There's a really rejuvenated invigorated, very passionate new grassroots movement of women's rights campaigners, many of whom have never actually been politically active in any way, who have come together on this. I think there's about 20 new groups in Scotland, something like that, which have sprung up in the last few years. And there are also specific groups. So there's also survivors groups, for instance, who are trying to raise concerns of victims of male violence when they lose access to single-sex spaces and services. But there are also detransitioners. So those are, well, mostly young.
Yeah, actually, tell me about that. So look, there is a complaint that I've heard of where you actually believe that you shouldn't have your arm, right? I know that sounds silly,
yes.
But there's a particular medical condition.
That is this is part of these things are called body dysmorphic disorders.
Yeah. So look, at the end of the day, if you believe that you shouldn't have a hand, the solution is not to amputate the hand. Right now, I'm not being funny. Now, at the end of the day, you can amputate the hand if you want, but that won't resolve the problem. The problem, yes. and very often what we are finding, now you know this better than me, but we're finding that people who suffer from gender dysmorphia, they will transition to the other gender. Well, of course, they still suffer from the mental illness. Therefore, they want to transition back.
And that's one of the issues we're facing. And this isn't just Scotland, by the way. 2 weeks ago, I was at a women's rights conference in Germany. Germany is facing all of the same problems we're facing. Public awareness isn't as good as it is in the UK. But they've got all the same problems. And there were young women there who were detransitioners. And that's what they talked about. They said we had very serious mental health issues. We were very vulnerable and the medical profession let us down. And this is the same story you hear from detransitioners in Scotland, who will tell you that they were promised, actually, you know, since you identify as trans, this is your problem all along. And if you transition, your problems will be solved. I just
feel as if it sounds on the face of it to be cruel not to pander to people, but I actually think in some respects it's important to do that. Now, I'll tell you my own political view. My own political view is this: you own your body. It's the most important thing you'll ever own. Do with it what you will, enjoy it, because it's the most important thing you've got in your life. But if you believe that you were born a woman in a male body, then you're wrong. Right? Now, if you want to then transition to being a woman or transition to being a man, then that's entirely up to you. But the central belief that you are a man living in a woman's body or a woman living in a man's body is centrally biologically untrue.
Well, there's certainly nothing backing that up scientifically, although the opposing side to our view will argue that there is. But I want to come back to the point you were making, that if you really believe there's something wrong with your body, the first port of call should also be to try and find out, why do you believe this?
Yes.
This is what used to happen. We know there's lots of research into particularly children who identify as trans and who have, these issues. There is certainly enough research showing that a lot of these children have issues that must be addressed, and they should ideally be addressed before you even go down the path of any medical transition, any medical treatment. The aim should always be to try and reconcile a child with his or her body,
yes,
so that they feel comfortable in the body that they actually inhabit. And this is something that if you look at anorexia or bulimia or any other issues that people may have with their bodies, this is what we're aiming to do.
But Maren, I've had exactly the same with friends of mine who are fundamentally unhappy. I mean, look, I've got a friend of mine who was incredibly good looking, but he constantly obsessed about having more and more and more cosmetic surgery. And I'm afraid, looks stranger and stranger and stranger as time goes on. But fundamentally, it struck me that he had started being much better looking than me. But he just couldn't accept it when he looked in the mirror. For whatever reason, what was looking back at him was something he was deeply unhappy with, and he was wrong.
And but that is certainly the issue, that we simply ignore the fact that someone may be very, very unhappy. And we don't look beyond that. We need to really, if we want to help people feel better, and this is what detransitioners tell you, they actually do feel better. So they embark on a medical transition, and at each stage they feel better, and then they don't.
Yes.
The old problems resurface,
Yes.
and then they go on the next stage and they feel better for
And
a
I
while.
suppose, and
then they don't.
And I suppose, in a sense, the battle itself is good, and then the battle, but the problem is when the battle's over, you've fundamentally achieved something you never wanted.
Yes.
Maren Smith, I could talk to you all night. I want to say good luck with your campaign. I think it's a genuinely.
Well, we're certainly not going to stop.
I think it's a genuinely laudable thing to look after the children and young people of Scotland. And I actually also think that you've demonstrated the level of respect for people who are genuinely trans, who do genuinely want to transition, and people who are fair-minded about all this. So that's Maren Smith from For Women Scotland. We're going to be talking about the strikes